Hello, class. Chapter 13 is about the spinal cord. I'm going to try this recording in a slightly different manner here and see how this goes for you. So before we jump into the anatomy and physiology of the spinal cord, let's just make sure we understand the overall function of this organ. So you actually have a few different functions. The first is probably the one we mostly think of, which is communication, right? It's responsible for carrying information up and down, sensory information from the body up to the brain, and then motor output from the brain to the rest of the body. So communication is one of our functions. The spinal cord is also responsible for many important reflexes. A reflex is just a rapid, automatic response to a specific stimuli. Reflexes happen so quickly that we don't always even want to send information to the brain to make a decision about what's going on and how to respond, but instead we'll allow the integration of that sensory information to take place in the spinal cord much more rapidly, sending a response. And third and final function is locomotion. Now, so locomotion is just really the fancy word for walking or running, right? For kind of that purposeful movement that's taking you somewhere. So think about walking. And locomotion, it requires a kind of series of repetitive muscle contractions, right? A certain order of events. When does your quadricep contract versus your gastrocnemius versus, right? And like what order? And so in the spinal cord, we house what are called simple pattern generators. And they actually have the information for how that works. So again, when you go walking, all those movements that you have to make while voluntary are completely unconscious, and not even your brain has to be involved in walking. At least the base movements of walking are handled by the spinal cord through those simple pattern generators. Well, it of course is always more complicated than that, and we'll get into it. Okay. So let's start with some gross anatomy, large-scale anatomy. Now, most of the anatomy you will be asked about in lab, but as we go through here, so hopefully as I point things out, that can help you on your lab practical. And then you're much more likely from me to see questions about the physiology, the function of these different structures as we go over them as well. So the spinal cord starts as it exits the cranium, so the foramen magnum, that large hole, and then the spinal cord extends to about the L1, L2 vertebrae. Now this is a little bit odd when we think about it. I really like this picture here, right? So we see L1 kind of being the end of the spinal cord. And so you have all this space right down that vertebral column where it's loose nerves instead of the true spinal cord. Anyway, how did this happen? Why is the spinal column longer than the spinal cord? Well, it turns out that your spinal cord stops growing at around age 4. And of course, you continued to grow. So all the bony structures in the musculature continued to elongate, but the spinal cord did not. So it terminates right around L1, and then we just see a series of nerves still moving through that space. A couple things they point out here, this cervical enlargement and also a lumbar enlargement. These are places that the spinal cord is a little bit wider. It's not a dramatic difference, but it is visible on the gross anatomy. And basically what happens here is this is where all the nerves of the upper limb are starting to arise, and the nerves of the pelvis and the lower limbs down here on this lumbar enlargement. Okay. The lumbar enlargement also is giving rise to what they call the cauda equina, so this whole string of nerves that exit once the spinal cord is done. This image maybe is very nice here, right? It kind of looks like a horse's tail, hence cauda equina. Other things they point out, the tip of the spinal cord is in fact cone-shaped. They call it the conus medullaris. And you do have what's called the filum terminale, an extension reaching from that conus medullaris all the way down here to the coccyx to hold the spinal cord in place. I kind of think of it as kind of tying down the spinal cord so it can't just like go whoop, rolling up within that vertebral column. All right, when we look at the spinal cord itself, the spinal cord, of course, is quite important, and so we give it lots of protection. We have the protection of the vertebrae, so a bony layer of protection, and then 3 layers of different membranes that are called meninges. The outermost is called the dura mater, and mater means mother. I think this must be German. And dura is tough. So this is one tough mother. It is extremely robust. When you see it in lab, you'll actually need scissors or a scalpel to cut through there. Lots of collagen fibers. This dura mater is then continuous, right? It actually enters up into the cranium and is going to surround the brain as well. That's true for all 3 of these layers. Just deep to that, we have the spider mother or arachnoid mater, a little bit looser, and then the pia mater is really a very delicate membrane, some elastic and collagen fibers, and really the key thing here is it is bound to the neural tissue. You're not really going to separate that from the spinal cord itself. Also, a couple other things to note. They're not pointing it out here, but I will. This space. So between the dura mater and the vertebrae, there is in fact a space. This is called the epidural space, right? There's blood vessels here, adipose, some loose connective tissue, and this is a place that's often used to insert what we would call an epidural, right? You put a needle into the epidural space and you add the anesthesia there, quite common in childbirth. There is also a bit of space kind of between this arachnoid mater and pia mater. It's the space, calling it a space is more of an artifact after the fact of dissection. Like in real life, it's not so much a space. It's filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and this is called the subarachnoid, right? So deep to underneath that arachnoid mater is the subarachnoid space. That is the location where you would do a spinal tap. So if you wanted a sample of cerebral spinal fluid, that's going to be your best place to grab that. Here's a picture of an actual spinal cord, right? Instead of that kind of cartoon, you can see here that the dura mater has been peeled back. That's what reflected means. So has the arachnoid mater. So we're really looking at that really thin, delicate pia mater on the surface of the spinal cord. They're showing some extensions here where the pia mater kind of anchors to the dura mater. And those are called denticulate ligaments. Okay, figure 13.5, we're looking at the cross-sectional anatomy of the spinal cord. And here we can jump in even a little more on some of these functions. So as you look at this cross-sectional anatomy, remember here in the center is the gray matter. I know in this picture it's a little brownish, right? But the gray matter. Remember what gray matter is. Right? It's those cell bodies, dendrites, synapses. There's very little myelin in the gray matter. And so this is going to be where information processing is taking place here in the spinal cord, right? It's surrounded then by white matter, which here we are in the central nervous system. So we are going to call all this white matter tracts, right? Remember, a tract is a bundle of axons. These are going to be myelinated, hence the white matter. Now, tracts get put together into what are called the columns. So an even bigger category, we have a posterior or dorsal column, a lateral column, and an anterior or ventral column. That's all white matter. It's all axons. And so that's going to be where that really fast traveling of messages, the communication up and down the spinal cord is taking place. Now, in this gray matter, right, that central core of the spinal cord, it kind of looks like a little butterfly. We have what are called the dorsal or posterior, right? Those are the same. This posterior gray horn and anterior gray horn, right? And then, of course, off on the side here, a little bump called the lateral gray horn. In the center, we see that both halves of the spinal cord are connected through what's called the gray commissure. They're separating it into a posterior and anterior. I've always just called that the gray commissure, right? The body of the butterfly where we link it together. And then right down the center, you see that hole. That is the central canal. Remember, that is lined with ependymal cells, creating and propelling cerebral spinal fluid through this central canal. Now, they're pointing out here kind of the function of these structures. So notice the posterior gray horn is where we house sensory information. So notice here coming off of the spinal cord, we have two roots. There's a ventral root, right, or an anterior root, and a dorsal root. Now the dorsal root always has this big bump called the dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal root and the ventral root come together, and that's when we form the spinal nerve that we're seeing up here kind of in this top picture. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but that's often a nice structure to look for if that's going to help you remember anterior, posterior, right? Anterior fissure, this nice deep fissure, as opposed to the posterior sulcus, which is fairly flimsy, but otherwise use that dorsal root. Anyway, the dorsal root is carrying sensory information into the spinal cord. Here we see where those cell bodies or where the synapses to the next neuron that's going to carry this the synapse, where it's going to carry this information up to the brain if that sensory information is coming from somatic sources, right? So proprioceptors, touch receptors, those sorts of things. There's where the sensory information lands. And then we see the visceral sensory information landing a little more forward, but still really on that posterior or dorsal horn. And then we see more anteriorly, this is where the motor nuclei are going to be housed. And again, nuclei just means a group of cell bodies in the central nervous system. And these are going to be where the synapses are taking place, and then a neuron is going to be carrying information out this ventral root, and that's always going to be motor information, right? So this little bump on the side, they call the lateral gray horn. That's going to be carrying, again, visceral information, so more neurons of the autonomic nervous system to those visceral organs. This ventral horn or anterior gray horn, again, bodies of somatic motor neurons live here, right? And then their axons are going to reach out and carry that message to things like skeletal muscle. Okay. In the white matter, we said this is all myelinated bundles of axons. Again, we call those tracts. The ascending tracts are carrying sensory information to the brain, and the descending tracts are carrying motor information out from the brain. When we look at a tract, they're always carrying information in the same direction of the same type. So each tract only houses sensory or only houses motor. I really like this image 13.7 from your textbook, because it's trying to show you what's going on here is actually quite complex. Let me try walking you through. So this image really is looking at the sensory information, and so notice all the neurons that we're dealing with are coming into this posterior side. Now remember, sensory information used unipolar neurons. So that's actually what they're showing you here. Remember, a ganglion is a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. And for sensory neurons, right, bringing information from the body, that cell body is going to hang out in the ganglion, right? An axon continues into that dorsal horn where it can then synapse with another neuron. Okay. Now what they're showing you here is you have all sorts of sensory information to collect, right? So we're getting some sensory information that's coming in from visceral organs, right? We've got some information coming from what are called interoceptors. So these are kind of sensing body position, right, of the body wall and the limbs. And then we also have sensory information from exteroceptors. So more proprioceptors, maybe things in the joints, in the skeletal muscles. We'll talk about some examples there. And then finally, same thing, but from the back portion of the body, more sensory information coming in. The key things here I want you to see, though, is this is all sensory information coming in, and that the cell bodies hang out here in the ganglia. This slide then is showing the motor output, right? Remember, we had two types of motor output on that lateral horn. We had the visceral motor output, so we can follow that in blue here, right? And this is going to then, of course, be going out to the viscera. Now, an interesting thing happens here. Don't worry about this too much at the moment, but notice there's another ganglion. When we get into the autonomic nervous system, we'll look at these more, but you actually have these clusters very distant from the spinal cord, places where these cell bodies are going to be hanging out, and these are particularly related to communicating with the viscera. So this one's kind of interesting, right? We're putting motor output here, right? And we see this going to the viscera, but we also see that it can synapse here with another neuron, right? And maybe carry this nerve then carrying more information to smooth muscle and things like that. Okay, somatic motor neurons then, they're showing you here in red. This is going to skeletal muscle and skeletal muscle, right? And the distinction here is body wall and limbs versus the back. Okay, so again, big thing is that we're doing motor output from that ventral or anterior side. Okay, a little more anatomy. So this is showing you the cross-section of a nerve. And just like we saw in skeletal muscle, each layer is going to have some wrapping. So they're showing you here an axon that has its Schwann cells myelinating it, right? But when we talk about a whole nerve, right, we said it's a bundle of axons. So here we see this axon has a little covering. You can see it kind of cut back here, called the endoneurium, right? Endo within. And then just like muscle, we put a bunch of individual nerves together, cells together, and then we wrap them, we bundle them in a fascicle. And this time the covering of that is called a perineurium. We put a bunch of fascicles together to form the nerve, and we throw one more covering on the outside called the epineurium. So epineurium on the outside of the nerve, perineurium on the fascicle, endoneurium on each individual neuron. Isn't this such a cool image, microscopic image of what's actually going on in a nerve? Notice there's actually blood vessels in the nerve, something we never think about, right? But these are extremely metabolically active cells, so they need that. Okay, so a couple other things that I'll just move through fairly quickly to point out. They do talk about the fact that, we have all these spinal nerves coming off of the spinal cord, right? And we have them named after which vertebrae, which intervertebral foramen they exit from. And you'll also, in more depth in lab, and also when we get to the brain, we'll talk about the cranial nerves. There are some nerves coming directly off the brain. What they're trying to point out here, though, is what we call the cervical plexus. So in the neck, we have a dramatic branching of all the nerves. I'm actually going to go to the next picture here. And what they're trying to show you, feel really lucky you don't have to learn this. When I was at CU and we had the human cadavers, we definitely dissected this, and the undergrads learned all these spinal nerves, who joined with whom to form what they called a trunk. And then they would separate again into these various divisions, move into what we called cords, and then eventually nerves, right? And really, I think for you, the thing to know here is that the nerves coming out of the cervical region are quite complicated. And the book did a nice job, I think, of describing what happened. So basically, you're innervating all of these muscle cells, and some of these muscles actually during development then fused together. And so what we're trying to do, say when we're like carrying the median nerve, right, we might have some information that we want to get down the median nerve from up here at C5, but then some other information that needs to come out of C8 or T1. So anyway, quite complicated. This so-called brachial plexus is important. This can get damaged in sports. Probably football is the place you hear about it the most. Someone stretches these nerves and they get the shooting, tingling, or paresthesia, feeling down their hand or arm. And you're really glad to know maybe that it's the brachial plexus and not a spinal cord injury. They call that a stinger when you stretch those nerves. The other thing that you want to know is that different nerves are innervating different patches of the body, and particularly the sensory side is very well mapped out. Here's the same thing. You have a lumbar or sacral plexus, this branching, quite complex, not as likely probably to get injured, though you do hear about the sciatic nerve a bit. So this is what I wanted to show you. These are what are called dermatomes. And so notice what they're mapping here is which spinal nerve innervates which portion of the body, right? So T1 is your pinky, C8, middle and ring finger there. And so what's interesting is if you have numbness in a finger, you're wondering, well, is that something with the ulnar nerve, or did I in fact damage something up here in the neck? And a lot of times that just depends on the mechanism of injury. But notice, right, this is like a pretty profound line and quite noticeable once you've damaged it. Okay, so dermatomes again are kind of that sensory map of where what nerves innervate what parts of the skin. Okay, so a couple patterns of how neuronal pools are organized. Now, a neuronal pool, we talked about this a little when we were in chapter 12 with just neurons. We're thinking about these nerve cells synapsing with each other, right, and how they're going to pass information. And so here's really the patterns that we see. We have the ability to kind of spread this signal out in what's called divergence. We have maybe a specific neuron with information that it wants to spread, and it wants to spread that broadly. And so it's able to pass that on to a few different neurons and kind of spread it out. We see this some in maybe, will be a good example. Sensory information coming into the central nervous system. I know these are all kind of showing more what looks like motor neurons, but when visual information is coming into the brain, we kind of spread it out to multiple different parts, right? We want some of that information to reach portions of the cortex where it can enter our consciousness, and we can say, oh, isn't that a beautiful picture? But then we want some of that sensory information to go maybe to some parts of our brain that we're not thinking about, like that help us with balance, right? If you stand on one foot and you keep your eyes open, it's easier to balance. And that's because part of that sensory input is going to parts of the brain that are for balance. Convergence, in this case, we have several neurons synapsing onto a single postsynaptic neuron. And this would be an example where Picture this neuron being the one telling the diaphragm to contract, right? We have multiple different neurons that can control that, right? So very often it's done by neurons passing the message that's quite subconsciously, but then we have neurons in other parts of the brain that can tell us to hold our breath, right? To stop the diaphragm from contracting. All right, so convergence. Serial processing, we're really just relaying the information, a presynaptic neuron to postsynaptic neuron. An example here would be a pain pathway. You keep passing that from one kind of neuron to the next, right, in sequence there. Parallel processing, here we want to pass the same information simultaneously. This does always have to start with divergence, right? So spreading it out. The example they give would be a reflex where maybe the output, you want to withdraw your foot from the tack you just stepped on. You also need to extend the other leg so you don't fall over, and you yell at the same time, right? So kind of spreading that information to all the players who need to know about it. And then finally, reverberation. And this is considered positive feedback where you have collaterals. Remember, on an axon, you could have this pretty pronounced branch called a collateral. It might actually be going back to the source, which is kind of funny, and further stimulating, right? So trying to kind of reinforce that we want this message to be spread by actually going back and telling the originator. This is pretty complicated. We'll see this when we get to the brain. Maybe in some areas, they think it's important in things like maintaining consciousness, right? So that you have this kind of constant message coming back around, which is kind of neat. Okay, let's talk about reflexes. That is really our last big topic in this chapter. So again, a reflex is this rapid automatic response to a specific stimuli. So notice a couple things here. It requires a stimulus. This is not spontaneous, right? It is a rapid response. We have few to no interneurons, right? And this really decreases the synaptic delay. In fact, a lot of times that neurotransmitter diffusing across the synapse and binding can be the slowest part of sending a signal. Reflexes are involuntary. They are difficult to suppress, right? The brain is informed, it can alter, inhibit, facilitate, but they are often difficult to suppress. So think about trying to stop a sneeze, right? Like maybe you can pull it off, but it's usually challenging. And finally, they are stereotyped, right? The response is the same. It's very predictable, right? So if the doctor taps your knee, your leg kicks. The doctor doesn't tap your knee and your like arm shoots up, right? It is a stereotyped response. So again, a rapid automatic response to a specific stimuli. Now, most of the time when we think about reflexes, we are thinking of somatic reflexes, things like muscle contraction, in the example of tapping your knee. But realize that there are also autonomic reflexes, right, where different glands are told to secrete, right, their products. Now, this is kind of a nice little classification matrix here. So we can split these reflexes a lot of different ways. So really you can talk about reflexes in any of these four ways. As far as development goes, there are innate reflexes, right? The withdrawal reflex, taking your hand away from something hot or painful. And then also suckling, right? If you touch a baby's mouth, it's going to start trying to nurse. That is innate. It's genetically determined. Right? Some we acquire later. The book gives the example of like how quickly you can hit the brakes when you're driving a car, right? You learned to drive a car, but you do develop this so-called muscle memory, and that is an acquired reflex. The light turns red, boom, you know to hit the brakes. Again, that response can either be somatic, going to skeletal muscle, or it can be visceral, going to things like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, a variety of glands. We can have monosynaptic reflexes, mono meaning one. There is only one synapse. Basically, the sensory neuron bringing the information in is going to synapse with the motor neuron carrying that information out. This is the quickest way to do it, right? There are polysynaptic reflexes as well, where you have to involve multiple different neurons, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that maybe you're like trying to communicate what's going on with the brain, or like we said, if you step on a tack, when you lift that leg, you need the other leg to be contracting. Processing. In this chapter, we're really talking about spinal reflexes, but there are some cranial reflexes associated particularly with the brainstem. We'll get into those in the next chapter, I'm sure. Okay, so here is the reflex arc. This is really the wiring of how every single reflex works, right? So see the reflex arc. We always have to have a receptor, right? And so in this case, we're looking at a somatic reflex here. This is a withdrawal reflex. And so our receptor here is a somatic receptor, right? It's on the skin. You can also have those in the skin, muscles, tendons, etc. So we have a receptor that is going to send information up an afferent nerve fiber, right? A sensory neuron. And this is going to go either to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Again, some of them do go to the brainstem. The part of the reflex arc that is occurring right here is really this information processing, right? We need integration to take place, and that's occurring with these synapses in the central nervous system. We'll then reach out to an efferent, right, a motor neuron. Okay, and in this case, our effector is going to be the skeletal muscle, right? And so that's where this motor output is heading. Right? So stimulus hitting a receptor, right? When you think of the reflex arc, stimulus activating a receptor, sending that message up a sensory neuron. We have some kind of integration or information processing in the CNS, and then activating a motor neuron, which responds with some effector. That's the reflex arc. So let's look at a couple examples. So this is an example of a monosynaptic reflex. It is called the stretch reflex. And this is a really common one that we're pretty familiar with. So here the doc is tapping the tendon, the patellar tendon here. And really what that does then is actually stretch the quadriceps muscle. So in the quadriceps, we have this kind of complicated they call it a muscle spindle fiber. It's a sensory receptor embedded in the skeletal muscle that measures stretch, right? So this is an example of what we would call a proprioceptor, sensing position and movement. Anyway, it's sending that information to the spinal cord. Notice here that integration, there is a single synapse. That's why this is monosynaptic. The sensory neuron actually touches the motor neuron, and here's our output to the effector. The effector in this case is the same muscle that spindle fiber is embedded in, and that muscle contracts, causing you to kick. And if you think about this, this is actually this is protective. It seems like a silly example, but that little tap of the hammer caused a very quick stretch, and so to keep that muscle from overstretching or ripping, we contract it in response. Okay, that's about as simple as a reflex gets, as a monosynaptic reflex. There is that muscle spindle fiber, right, the sensory. Okay, so here is a polysynaptic reflex. This is called the withdrawal reflex. And notice we now have many more synapses taking place here, right? So again, we have a stimulus, hot pan, right? That goes to a receptor, which sends the signal along a sensory neuron. And then we're going to have integration taking place here in the spinal cord. Now, what a polysynaptic reflex lets you do is go ahead and send information, in this case, right, we actually see maybe this information going up to the brain so that you can yell, wow, that was hot, right? And then we're going to send information out to out a motor neuron to our effectors. Again, in this case, we're looking at skeletal muscle. So if we need to let go of that pan, we're going to contract the biceps brachii here. And notice that this neuron is actually inhibiting the triceps, and that's going to make it easier for you to pull your hand away from that hot pan. All right, that's the withdrawal reflex. It gets more complicated. Here's an example called the crossed extensor reflex, where we're doing the withdrawal reflex, right? Our painful stimulus is going to tell us, right, when we communicate here, man, we need to get off the tack, right? We need to contract those hamstrings, right, to flex the knee. And here we're inhibiting the quadriceps, right? But we're removing ourselves from the painful stimuli. But notice in this case, we also send that message to the other side of the spinal cord, so we can talk to the, the left side of the body, and we're going to go ahead and contract the muscles to make sure that we can keep standing and that we don't just collapse into a pile on the ground, right? So the big thing in this crossed extensor reflex is that that message goes to the opposite side, or what we call the contralateral side, the side that wasn't injured, and go ahead and tell it to extend, right, to hold us up. There's plenty of other reflexes, but those are kind of some classic examples. Here's one some of you will know, maybe if you work as an EMT at all. This is called the Babinski reflex. So in a baby, if you rub a little like a spoon handle or something up the baby's foot, notice the toes kind of splaying out here, right? That is a positive response. In infants, that's fine. In an adult, right, if you run a spoon up the sole of their foot, the toes reflexively curl. Try this on each other. If the toes splay out, that's actually a really bad sign. That's a sign of neurological injury for sure. Okay, so here we are, right? We just looked at kind of this sensory input into those centers in the spinal cord, and then we know that that motor output can, of course, go to any of these effectors. That's chapter 13. On Wednesday, we'll be in chapter 14, which is about the brain, and we'll look at some similar information and then also get into some much more complicated portions of the brain as well. Okay, have a great day.